You might know the story of Russia's invasion of Ukraine by heart. But here's what flips the story on its head. Some Russians are choosing to fight for Ukraine. They're grabbing weapons, crossing borders, and putting their lives on the line to stand against their own country.
This year, 3 independent Russian militias took up arms against their own state.
Denis Nikitin is the founder of the Russian Volunteer Corps, a militia fighting alongside Ukraine.
A group of Russians is training to go into battle against their fellow citizens. The new unit, which is officially part of Ukraine's armed forces, is known as the Siberian Battalion.
And soon they will be taking aim at Russian positions. They are part of the Siberian Battalion.
These are people from cities like Moscow, far-off places like Yakutsk, or smaller towns like Irkutsk, who have decided to fight the very system they grew up with. What makes this even wilder is that these stories aren't just starry-eyed dreamers or angry protesters. Some are ex-soldiers who once fought for Putin, while others are ethnic minorities burdened by reasons we'll get into soon. In this video, we'll dive deep into the war's most surprising stories. Russians who risk exile, torture, or even death to stand up to Putin's war machine. They didn't just switch sides, they walked away from safety, from home, from everything they knew, just to fight for something better. And if you think more people should hear their stories, hit like and subscribe. Your support helps break the silence and tells the algorithm that this story matters. To understand them better, let's start by getting to know these volunteers and what's pushing them to take such a bold stand. These aren't people who just feel bad for Ukraine and want to send help. They're Russians who reject the way their country is run. They don't hate Russia itself, they're often proud of their homeland, but they can't stand Putin's iron grip. Many want to see his control end and bring back a sense of pride and freedom to Russia. They see the war in Ukraine as part of a bigger problem, a reflection of a government that's corrupt, silences voices, and holds all the power in the hands of the few. Some dream of a Russia where people can speak their minds without worrying about a knock on the door. Others want their regions, far from Moscow, to have more say in how things are run. This movement started picking up steam when Russia launched its full invasion in 2022, and it's only grown since then. Now, in 2025, Ukrainian officials estimate around 2,500 to 3,000 Russians are fighting for Ukraine in some way. Though exact numbers are hard to pin down because many keep their identities secret to stay safe, one thing's clear. This isn't just a few people. It's a real movement that's gaining ground. That variety shows up in their backgrounds, too. When you look closer, you see how different these volunteers are from one another. They come from all walks of life, which makes their choice to fight even more striking. Some are former Russian soldiers who served in the army, but got fed up with orders they thought were wrong. Many were sent to Ukraine in the early days of the war, saw the destruction firsthand, towns leveled, families torn apart, and they decided they couldn't keep fighting for Russia. Instead, they switched sides. Others are activists who used to protest in Russia, holding signs or sharing posts online, but had to flee when the police started cracking down. Some are even ex-prisoners of war who were captured by Ukraine and chose to stay and fight rather than go back to Russia, where they might face punishment or worse. Then there are ethnic minorities from places like Buryatia, Yakutia, or Kalmykia. These groups feel like Moscow treats them like second-class citizens. They're often sent to the most dangerous parts of the war in huge numbers compared to others. Currently, independent studies show that soldiers from these regions are dying at 2 to 3 times the rate of ethnic Russians from big cities. For example, minorities make up about 1 in every 10 people in Russia, but a quarter of the soldiers killed in Ukraine. This happens because poverty in their regions pushes them to sign military contracts just to make a living, only to be thrown into the worst battles with little care. Take the Buryats, for instance. They're from a region near Mongolia with their own language and traditions. Many joined the army because there aren't enough jobs back home, but they end up in the deadliest spots. In 2024, Ukraine reports said Buryat units lost an estimated 30% of their fighters in battles around Donetsk. It's a similar story for the Yakuts, who live in the freezing far north, where life is already tough because of the harsh climate. Kalmyks, a Buddhist people from the southern steppes, feel like Moscow's leaders don't care about them at all. For these groups, the war is just another way Russia uses them, like it did in older conflicts in places like Chechnya. When they join Ukraine's side, they're fighting back against that unfair system. They bring skills from their time in the Russian military, like handling cold weather or using certain weapons, which help Ukraine a lot. They know the tactics because they once trained under the very officers they now fight against. This gives Ukraine a big edge when planning attacks or defenses. Knowing what drives them makes their next steps clearer. They don't just cross the border to fight alone. They group together, building units that turn their anger and experience into something Ukraine can actually use. One of the main groups is the Russian Volunteer Corps, or RVC. This unit is known for its daring moves, like sneaking across the border into Russia in areas like Bryansk or Belgorod to hit supply lines or cause trouble. These raids make Russia pull troops away from the front to protect its own land. The RVC is led by Denis Nikitin, who goes by White Rex. He's a controversial figure because he's been tied to far-right nationalist ideas in the past. We'll talk more about that later, but in this war, the RVC focuses on fighting Putin. That is who they see as the real enemy of Russia's true values. In May of 2024, they pulled off a raid in Belgorod, taking over small villages for a few hours and wrecking Russian equipment. Ukraine said it destroyed over 15 vehicles in that attack. Russia called it terrorism, but the RVC said they wanted to show that Russia's borders aren't as safe as the Kremlin claims. One fighter later said crossing back into Ukraine felt strange. He'd spent his life thinking of Russia as home, but now it was the place he had to attack to save it. Ukraine keeps some distance from the RVC in public because of Kapustin's past, but they still work together on things like disrupting Russian supply chains. The RVC has about 200 fighters, mostly Russians who crossed over early in the war, and they often use captured Russian weapons, which makes their attacks feel like Russia's fighting itself. In recent months, their special forces targeted Russian positions with heavy machine guns in the Kupiansk direction. They even got advanced Katrin naval drones in April this year to support strikes in the Black Sea. But not all of the volunteers want to raid and vanish. Some are thinking longer term. Building a force that could one day march back into Russia is something more than just a shadow unit. That brings us to the Freedom of Russia Legion, or the FRL, which started in 2022 with Russian defectors and prisoners of war who refused to go back home. Today, they have over 1,000 fighters, and their goal is straightforward: take down Putin and build a Russia where people can vote and speak freely. They run a program called the Path of Honor that helps Russian soldiers defect safely, offering them a way out and support. This has brought in hundreds of new fighters, especially after Russia lost big in battles like Bakhmut. Some of the defectors arrive shaking, still in Russian uniforms, with tags of fallen friends stuffed in their pockets. They swap those uniforms for Ukrainian ones and go straight to training. In late 2024, during a counteroffensive in Kharkiv, the FRL helped push back Russian forces, retaking over 150 square kilometers of land. They're remarkably great in city fights, where the combat is close and brutal. In June, they hit a Russian fuel depot in occupied Zaporizhia, messing up supply lines and slowing down an attack. Unlike the RVC, the FRL's push for democracy makes them less controversial, and they get better gear from Ukraine, like drones or anti-tank weapons. Their leaders, many of whom are ex-military, make them dependable in battle. They also make videos and posts online, calling on Russians to resist Putin, which have reached millions. Ukrainian intelligence says these messages led to about 200 Russian soldiers defecting so far this year. In March of this year, they marked 3 years of fighting, showing their lasting commitment. And then there are those who aren't just fighting for a free Russia, they're fighting for their forgotten homelands, places Moscow has used for decades without giving anything back. That brings us to the Siberian Battalion, which is made up of mostly Buryats, Yakuts, and other Siberian minorities. This group, formed in 2023, has around 60 fighters and takes a strong stand against what they call Moscow's empire. They see Russia's government as using far-off regions like theirs to fight its wars while giving them little in return. Their battalion is led by Vladislav Amosov, a former officer in Russia's GRU military intelligence, who defected after seeing how minorities were treated in the army. In July, they attacked a supply depot in occupied Luhansk, destroying fuel and weapons worth millions of dollars. For Amosov, it wasn't just strategy. He said seeing captured Russian soldiers call him a traitor reminded him of why he left, because he refused to be silent while his own people were being used as cannon fodder. The Siberian Battalion's skills, from living in Siberia's harsh conditions, like surviving freezing winters or navigating tough terrain, make them valuable in battles like those in Zaporizhia, where they kept supply routes open during heavy snow. Ukraine trusts them because their anger at Moscow runs deep, making it unlikely they'd switch back. The battalion also uses its raids to show Russia's own people are turning against it, sharing videos of their missions deep into Russian territory. In July of this year, they captured injured Russian soldiers fighting a battle in the Kharkiv forest. These groups don't always work alone, and that teamwork adds another layer to their efforts. In March of last year, the RVC, FRL, and the Siberian Battalion worked together on a raid into Belgorod. They crossed from Ukraine, held ground for hours, and forced Russia to send 10,000 troops to deal with them, pulling those soldiers away from fighting in Donetsk. Ukrainian reports say the raid wrecked equipment and caused dozens of Russian casualties. This kind of joint action shows how these volunteers take on dangerous jobs that Ukraine's regular army might shy away from. But it's not always smooth. Ukraine has to juggle its different goals, like the RVC's nationalism, the FRL's push for democracy, and Siberia's forces on regional rights, to keep everyone working together. Some units even incorporate smaller factions, such as the RVC, adding the Karelian group in late 2023, which includes separatists from northwestern Russia seeking more independence for their areas. So what makes them risk everything? A lot of it comes down to being fed up with what's happening. They're angry about Putin's regime, the way it shuts down free speech, locks up protesters, and commits war crimes. Around June, the United Nations confirmed over 13,300 civilian deaths in Ukraine, with thousands more likely uncounted in places like Mariupol, where entire city blocks are still rubble. Volunteers hear about torture, mass graves, and bombed-out schools, and it hits them hard. They feel like doing nothing makes them part of the problem. Many have personal reasons as well. Some lost family or friends in protests back in Russia, where over 20,000 people have been arrested for speaking out since 2022, according to groups like OVD Info. Others had loved ones or fellow soldiers die in pointless attacks, like in Bakhmut, where Russian commanders sent wave after wave of troops to their deaths. These losses fuel their resolve to fight for what's right. For ethnic minorities, the reasons go even deeper. Groups like the Buryats and the Yakuts are sent to the worst parts of the war. They're treated like cannon fodder, sent to die in places like Donetsk and Kharkiv. Recent reports highlight how Arctic indigenous peoples and Central Asian migrants are overrepresented in casualties, with Russia coercing them into service. They want a Russia where their communities aren't used in this way, where they have a real voice. Many also face personal threats, like getting arrested for speaking out or having their families harassed. For them, escaping to Ukraine is the only way to live without fear. They see staying neutral as letting the system win, so picking up a weapon feels like the only path left. Their dreams for Russia vary. Some want a full democracy where everyone votes and speaks freely. Others want their regions to have more power, so Moscow can't keep calling the shots. A saying among Siberian fighters is that they would rather die free than live as Putin's tools. That kind of belief keeps them going, and it's why defection programs saw a 15% jump in Russian soldiers reaching out this year. Overall, analysts believe desertions may have topped 50,000 since 2022, showing cracks in morale. These volunteers do more than just fight. They bring something special to Ukraine's war effort. On the battlefield, they're a big deal. Their raids into Russian regions like Bryansk or Kursk create chaos, forcing Russia to guard its own borders. In the first months of this year, these attacks tied up several thousand Russian troops, which helped Ukraine by taking the pressure off of cities like Kharkiv. The FRL's hit-and-run tactics, like blowing up fuel depots or ambushing convoys, slows down Russian advances. In Donetsk, their sabotage delayed attacks for weeks. In tough city fights like in Bakhmut, their knowledge of Russian tactics makes a difference. Many were trained in Russia's army, so they know how commanders plan, how troops move, and where things might go wrong. Earlier this year, the FRL and RVC fighters helped hold streets in Bakhmut, saving a Ukrainian unit from being surrounded. The Siberian Battalion's ability to work in brutal winters kept supplies moving during snowstorms, getting ammo to cut off troops. Their attacks aren't just about hitting supply lines. Every mission sends a message, both to Ukrainians they fight beside and to Russians watching from the other side of the border. Since they know Russian bases, convoys, and systems so well, they can hit important targets. In June, the FRL blew up a bridge in occupied Rostov, cutting off key routes for Russian reinforcements and costing millions in delays. Leaders like Amosov, with his GRU background, share high-level details, like how Russia's command posts work. This helped Ukraine strike a post in Luhansk, taking out senior officials and throwing plans into chaos. By June, Ukrainian reports credit these volunteers with over 150 sabotage missions, though the exact number is hard to confirm. Beyond fighting, they have a huge symbolic impact. Seeing Russians fighting against Russians pokes holes in Putin's claim that everyone in Russia supports the war. Their videos showing burning Russian flags or captured soldiers spread online and make people question things. Ukraine uses this in its propaganda, sharing FRL messages that have reached 4 million Russians on Telegram this year. leading to 1,000 soldiers contacting defection hotlines. This mental blow is just as big as any tank they can destroy. It even inspires small acts of resistance back home, as Russia is now seeing a rise in sabotage cases, such as cutting power lines or derailing trains. But their work comes with limits and huge risks. Ukraine doesn't fully trust them, and it's easy to see why. Loyalty is hard to prove when someone comes from the enemy's ranks. Every volunteer gets vetted, sometimes for months, and some face restrictions on what missions they can join. Throughout this year, Ukrainian intelligence uncovered a handful of spies posed as defectors, which tightens scrutiny. This suspicion creates tension. Volunteers often feel like they're under a microscope, proving their worth daily. If Russia captures them, it's almost certain death, often after torture. Russian courts now hand out life sentences for treason, and almost 100 volunteers have been executed since 2022 per human rights groups. Their families back home face trouble too. Police raids, lost jobs, or worse. This year alone, over 600 families reported harassment. Volunteers try to hide with masks or fake names, but Russian facial recognition tech makes that hard. There's also the risk of being used and discarded. Ukraine needs these fighters now, but what happens when the war ends? Some worry they'll be seen as liabilities, especially if peace talks require Ukraine to distance itself from Russian dissidents. The volunteers know this, yet they keep fighting. Their impact, while real, is not a game changer on its own. They are still a small force, but they punch far above their weight. However, the future is still very much uncertain, and the post-war risks remain high. There's also a lot of debate around these groups. Ukraine needs their skills, but some, like the RVC, cause headaches. Kapustin's far-right past makes Western countries nervous, and some European officials question Ukraine's ties to the RVC. Ukraine says the RVC works on its own, but they still team up for raids, which creates a tricky balance. News stories about the RVC sparks arguments about whether Ukraine is leaning on extremists. Dropping the RVC would mean losing a group that's been an effective ally in messing up Russia's plans, so it's not an easy call. The FRL and Siberian Battalion get less criticism. The FRL's talk of democracy and Sibir's focus on minority struggles fit better with Ukraine's message. Still, many Ukrainians don't fully trust any Russian fighters, worried that they might have hidden reasons for joining. International views add to this, with some allies wary of far-right elements, while others see the volunteers as key to weakening Putin from within. Russia uses all of this to fuel its own story. Its state media calls these volunteers traitors or Nazis, ignoring that they're Russians fighting their own government. This helps Putin rally support and justify things like sending more troops to the border or bombing areas where volunteers might be, which sometimes kills civilians. It's a messy cycle, where the volunteers' actions give Ukraine an edge but also stir up trouble. For example, Russia has stepped up its hunt, with FSB killing several volunteers this year, including targeted strikes like a car bomb in Kyiv that took out 2 FRL leaders. What happens to these volunteers when the war ends is a big question with no clear answer. If Ukraine wins, some hope to stay there, seeing it as safer than Russia under Putin. So far, about 1,200 applied to live in Ukraine, but only 250 have passed through the tough security checks. The FRL's push for democracy might make them welcome, but the RVC's nationalist ties could make them seem risky. If Putin stays in power, going back to Russia is off the table. New laws there mean life in prison for defectors, plus public shaming. Over 600 families of volunteers have lost their homes or pensions to date. Leaving for other countries like Poland or Lithuania is an option, but it's tough. Only 350 have gotten asylum, and places like Germany turned away many more over concerns about extremism. Some volunteers might end up with nowhere to go, stuck without a country. A few talk about building their own communities in exile, but it's hard without money or support. This uncertainty weighs on them, yet it also drives them to prove their value through more missions. Their fight also points to a bigger issue in Russia. Protests against the war have led to over 20,000 arrests to date. I mean, just look at this one case of absolute brutality. The volunteers' raids and videos inspire small acts of resistance, like cutting power to army bases or derailing trains, which jumped 25% this year. The FRL's call for free elections excites younger Russians online. Sibir's push for regional power speaks to minorities, who make up 1 in 5 Russians. Even the RVC's nationalism draws in people who want a Russia free from Putin's rule. These ideas don't always line up. and Russia's tight control, with cameras watching 80% of the cities, makes dissent dangerous. Most Russians stay quiet, with polls showing that 60 to 70% of Russians still support Putin, though some private surveys say it's closer to 50%. It's not a full uprising, but the volunteers' actions plant seeds for change. Surveys of Russian soldiers in Ukraine show nearly 3/4 want an immediate end to the war, hinting at a growing fatigue. The emotional weight of their choice is what keeps them going. They live with constant danger, knowing every mission could be their last. Ukraine can't always protect them, as its resources are tied up in defending cities like Odessa that have been hit hard this year and have over 2,000 civilian deaths. Yet the volunteers keep signing up. They train in secret camps, learning to use NATO weapons like javelins, which they turn against their former army. Their commitment comes from a belief that fighting now might save lives later, even if they themselves don't see the results. This story doesn't fit neatly into one box. These volunteers are not just heroes or traitors. They're people caught in a war that forces hard choices. Ukraine leans on them for tactical wins, but keeps them at an arm's length to avoid political fallout. Russia demonizes them to rally its people, yet fears the doubt they sow. The numbers have grown to over 2,500 active fighters, a small but growing thorn in the Kremlin's side. They chose to act, risking everything for a chance at a different Russia. Whether they're the first step towards change or just a footnote, their fight proves that even in war, some will cross lines for what they believe. In a war built on fear and control, these Russians chose one thing Moscow never expected: to fight for freedom, even if it costs them everything.